And we take you live now to the Greens Deputy Leader, Adam Bandt, holding a news conference in Canberra.
Then the government will take the axe to our research budget. Australia's economic future depends on research. Tony Abbott is now threatening the economic prosperity of this country in an attempt to get his unfair budget passed. If the government proceeds with its threats to cut research funding, it will be met with the mother of all protests. When the Labor government tried to cut funding to health and medical research, scientists and researchers took to the streets in their lab coats in their thousands, and we beat the budget cuts. That will happen again to the power of 10. The government has missed the point that the Australian people and the Parliament are telling it very, very clearly. It needs to scrap the unfair budget and go back and start again. We will not have a gun held to our head in an attempt to force people to vote for cuts to university funding and to put students into further debt. The government needs to hear the message that's coming very loudly and very clearly. When you said there would be no cuts to education and health, many people believe you, and they want the Parliament to hold Tony Abbott to that promise. On another matter, the Greens have got a bill before Parliament to require Parliament to approve any deployment of troops overseas. We could have that bill debated tomorrow if Tony Abbott and Labor would allow it to be brought to the floor of Parliament. So far, they've stood in the way of that bill being debated. But Australia needs to join other democracies that say some form of parliamentary debate and approval is needed before we deploy our troops overseas, including to Iraq. So I'm calling on the Prime Minister to allow time for the Greens bill to require parliamentary approval of overseas troops to be debated in Parliament, because I think most people in this country want at least a debate in Parliament before we put our troops in harm's way.
Mr Bandt, does your bill extend to there are reports today of an enhanced military involvement for Australia, not necessarily troops on the ground, but you know, the RAF being more involved. Would your bill cover that, or is that something that should be debated as well?
The bill that we've got in the House of Representatives applies to any overseas troops deployment, and so it would cover those kind of actions potentially, but look, I think the purpose of a debate is that it allows the Parliament to consider, first of all, what are the arguments for and against, but secondly, if there were to be some kind of deployment, of what form should it take? So all of these things could be debated in the Parliament if our bill was given a chance to be debated by the Prime Minister.
Are you concerned that this sort of, there's a step each time it's sort of inching further to more involved?
I think the Greens, like most people in this country, have grave concerns that Australian troops may be sent overseas. We've seen what has happened in the past in Iraq. It has made the problem worse, and we were told last time that military intervention would prevent these kind of atrocities from happening in the first place, and that's clearly not the case. The Greens are worried that the Prime Minister might be engaging in a bit of mission creep of having troops first there doing one job and then extending to another, and that's why we need some openness and transparency and a full parliamentary debate.
So would you oppose the deployment of troops, or are you against it? What's your position?
Well, at the moment there's a good case to be made for humanitarian assistance, and that's something we've said for some time, but I don't think that there's a case that has been yet made for deployment of Australian troops that would in any way make things better. In fact, history tells us it would make things worse, and I think that's a sentiment that most people around the country share.
So is there anything more that we can do?
I think that history tells us that the best way to bring peace and stability to a region is to support the people on the ground in those countries who are striving for peace and democracy, and that includes foreign aid where necessary. And instead we've got a government that is cutting our foreign aid budget and it's turning its back on humanitarianism where it counts. So as to what we can do, well, we could push for lasting peace and stability, and that means participating in multilateral forums and enhancing our aid spending rather than just thinking military intervention's a cure-all every time, because it's just not.
Mr Mayor, what do you make of Caltex cutting 350 jobs across the country on the same day it announces a $160 million profit?
Well, look, I think there's a real question about the jobs plan for this country as we move towards a clean economy, and the Greens are very worried that this government has got no plan. I mean, people, when jobs are lost, it affects them, it affects their families, it affects whole states. In Victoria, we've seen the effects of big employers pulling out and the government standing by and washing its hands without any plan to support people. As the economy transitions, we need government to step in and say, where are the new jobs going to come from? How can we support people? And this is a classic example of where, in Victoria, for example, the future in part lies in advanced manufacturing. The government needs to be encouraging research and development in advanced manufacturing so that when people lose their jobs at the hands of companies that are making multi-million-dollar profits, there's jobs for them to go to. And at the moment, the government's just asleep at the wheel.
Just on the issue of Iraq, Andrew Wilkie has spoken today in Tasmania about putting forward his measures, which seem quite similar to yours. Have you discussed sort of working together on this?
Well, in the Greens for some time have called for parliamentary approval. In the House of Representatives, Andrew Wilkie is seconding that bill. So this would be a great opportunity to give the voice to the Australian people that at the moment is only being represented by the crossbenchers.
Do you think that the general stance of bipartisanship on matters of defence and national security mean that these things don't get properly debated in the community?
This is another classic example of Labor and Liberal being in lockstep with each other but out of step with the community. Over many, many years now, the Greens have stood up for greater transparency and debate on issues that matter to people in Parliament, and it's no answer to say that just because Labor and Liberal agree on these things they shouldn't be debated in Parliament, because when you have debate in Parliament and you let the sunlight in, then often that can change people's minds. And at the moment the people of Australia are relying on the Greens to be their voice in Parliament, and this is another example. Thanks very much.